Hello, and welcome to today's QDU Academy session. Today, we're going to be looking at the Round 3 topic for Year 7 for 2024, and that topic is that parents should charge their children living costs, for example, for rent, utilities, and food. As always in these sessions, we're going to start by looking at the context behind this debate. We're then going to look at setup, which is everything that goes before your points, so your models and your definitions. We're then going to look at brainstorming points, structuring points and practice, and then going into some final tips at the end. So, to start off with, we always begin our preparation for long prep debates by looking at a couple of pieces of context. Now, the context is important because it helps you understand what is currently going on in the world. This can help with a couple of things. Firstly, it can help with understanding if there is a big problem in the world that needs to be solved, because if you understand really clearly what a big problem that currently exists is, it makes it very easy to write arguments that explain how you solve that problem. The second thing it helps with is it just helps teams understand what the current state of play of this policy is. So in this particular topic, you get to see, is there currently a rule that parents should charge their children for living expenses? Because if there is, that changes whether the affirmative team should be looking at whether they're changing the world or not. And it helps the negative team also understand whether they are defending a world that currently exists, or if they are the team that is defending a world that is likely to change. I think that there are a couple of questions that are important to look at in setup for this particular debate. So, I think the first of these questions is just sort of broadly, is there a problem that we're trying to solve? Now, you very well may have heard the term cost of living crisis on the news or in discussions in school or with your parents or something like that during the past few years, I guess. And that's because this is sort of an increasingly big problem within Australia. And maybe if you have some idea about what this currently is, it will help you have some idea of a problem that might exist within the world. It's useful to sort of understand if there is a problem that needs to be solved. But I think the second thing that's important in this particular debate is to look at how this policy could functionally operate. The reason why this is significant is that usually the way that, in fact, possibly the only way that most children make money until they are old enough to have an actual job is that parents tend to give them pocket money. And so it's probably the case that this is something that changes the world quite dramatically, particularly for younger children. So I think you want to firstly understand, how are we expecting children to get the money for parents to charge them? How are they going to be able to be charged? But secondly, what is the kind of number that we are expecting children to be charged? Or at very least, what is the cost of living so we can apportion a fraction of that to what children are likely to be charged? So in this particular debate, context is very important in understanding what kind of models teams might be running. The next thing to look at is defining the topic. As always, there are going to be a few terms that are important to define, and we'll go through these ones here. Firstly, just defining the term parents. And obviously with definitions, it's often the case that many words teams are just going to agree about, and there's only a couple of words that might be disagreed on by the teams in any given debate. I think parents is the kind of word that everyone is likely to agree on. I think if an affirmative team defined this topic as being like a legal guardian, so even if it was not your biological parent, but it's still the adult that like has legal responsibility for you, that isn't going to change either team's arguments functionally. And so that would be a reasonable definition as well, or just defining it as like parents means parents. Teams are going to understand. The second thing is children. Children is a slightly more interesting word, because often in debating, when we look at children, we think of people that are either under 18 or under 13. In this particular debate, there is a bit of a question of what is a reasonable age for a child to be considered for this topic? Because it seems incredibly unreasonable for parents to charge children who are like 2 years old for living expenses, because those children do not have the means to pay the parents back. They cannot earn money. They are like 2 years old. They're entirely dependent on the parents, which means that it's probably worth thinking, what is a reasonable age for this policy to start rather than necessarily to end? You can likewise have a question of, if a child is like 18, so a legal adult, but they are still the child of their parents and they are still living at home, should this policy apply to them as well? Should they also be paying parents for living expenses? Is another question that you might want to ask in terms of working out what you want children to mean. The final thing is living costs. Living costs sometimes would be a difficult concept to understand, but the topic kind of gives you 3 examples. So hopefully that's one that is more accessible in terms of working out what exactly that should mean. It broadly is going to mean things like rent or housing costs, food, and utilities, as is given in the topic. The next thing is to look at models. So the first thing is to look at affirmative team models, and there are a few questions that are worth asking. The first is to, and whilst this is not necessarily a model, it is something that you want to have good answers to, because it's reasonable for the negative team to have a lot of criticism about it, is how do you expect children to earn money? Maybe you want to set up some kind of government program that helps them earn money. Maybe you just expect them to find their own way, but you do definitely want to think about it, even if it isn't going to be part of your model. The second thing is a question of how much should they pay? And this is a bit of an interesting question, because your number could vary from being very small to incredibly big, and I think all of them would be defensible. At one very extreme end, you might think, oh, well, obviously we can't charge a 5-year-old rent because they have no means for earning money. But that is still a cost that the parent needs to pay, is the cost of taking care of a 5-year-old. And so that means that when we say, let's say that they start getting charged when they turn, and I can't exactly remember how old you need to be to have a job, but let's say that they're going to start charging you when you turn 15, and you should pay a really, really big amount, because you're not just paying for right now, you're also paying for the previous 15 years that you have not been able to pay. Maybe that is the model that you want to go for, because that is a model that seems incredibly fair, and it seems really fair to the parents to get that money back. You might equally have something that's a bit smaller. You might say, oh, well, we don't expect them to need to pay for anything that goes before they are capable of earning money. We think that that's not their responsibility. But as soon as they're able to earn money, they should be paying for their portion of everything. And so maybe when you turn however old you are when this policy starts, it means that you need to pay as much as, let's say you're in a family of 5 people, 1/5 of the rent, 1/5 of the food, 1/5 of the utilities. Now, the final thing that you could do is you could suggest, hold on, all of these numbers are going to be absolutely ridiculously huge, and we do not want children to have basically no childhood because they're too busy paying their parents. And actually, we think they need to pay their parents, but it's only going to be a fraction of the actual costs. So if, for example, you had a weekly shopping bill that was however many dollars, you would need to pay your portion of it, but 1/10 of your portion of it, or 1/5, or 1/4, or 1/2, or something like that. That means that actually the number is not that big, and you might pick that number if your strategy in the debate is less about fairness, but is more about sort of experience gained for the child. And you can sort of see how there's strategic benefits to each one. The most fair thing might be an incredibly big number, but maybe the most beneficial thing in terms of what is good for the child is something a bit smaller because it places less stress. And it's up to the affirmative team to work out what number they think is going to be reasonable. As the negative team, you just sort of need to be willing to adapt to whatever the affirmative team says. And that means that you might need to think that some of your arguments might be better than others depending on what their model is. And sometimes that's just the way that debating operates. But that doesn't mean that you cannot still attack whatever their model is, because as much as there are benefits to each one, there are harms to each one as well. The final thing is negative teams. This is not particularly a debate where I think a counter model is hugely necessary. And I think the reason for that is that this policy probably isn't going to solve any big problem in society in terms of will it solve the cost of living crisis? An affirmative team might try. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult to prove that. because people still need to on net like pay as much regardless, and it doesn't necessarily solve like income problems. Which means that I think that actually this is just a debate about whether this is a good thing by itself or not, and so I don't think the negative team is going to need a countermodel. But as always, if you really like one, go ahead. Just definitely this shouldn't be a debate where you're over-relying on your countermodel. The next thing is to look at arguments, and we're going to start here by looking at a particular type of argument that I think is quite interesting. And this is a type of argument that is called principled arguments. Now, the point of a principled argument is that it talks about people's rights and responsibilities. Most arguments in debating are very practical. They are about the outcomes that happen to people, whether people are made happier, whether people are made sadder, whether people are made healthier, whether people are made to have more or less free time, whether people have more or less stress. All of these things that are very much about the outcome they have on people's livelihood and whether their lives become better. Principled arguments are very different because they are not about outcomes. They are about whether things are good in and of themselves. And that's why they're often about rights and responsibilities. Because things like rights and responsibilities exist not necessarily. Often they exist because they benefit people, but they also just exist because people believe them to be good. Look at concepts such as privacy. People care about privacy. Even beyond any outcome, if someone was following you and you didn't know, so it wasn't hurting you, you'd still feel uncomfortable with the fact that someone might be following you. And that proves that you care about privacy. Maybe you care about free speech. Maybe you care about freedom. Maybe you care about, in this particular debate, responsibilities. And so there are reasons why both teams might think that it is the responsibility of one group to pay for the living costs of children. The affirmative team might argue that the children have a responsibility to pay because of many things that the parents do. The negative team might think that the parents have the responsibility to provide for the child, and they shouldn't be expecting on the child to pay on a moral level. When you run these kinds of arguments, the big thing to look at is to ask the question of why do people have that right, or in this case, that responsibility? Because if you can explain that very well, it provides a very compelling argument. And so look at, for example, if you're the affirmative, if the children have the responsibility, why do they have that responsibility? If the parents have that responsibility, why do they? Don't just say that they do, because then there's a risk that both teams will just give arguments that say one has the responsibility, no, the other does. You want to explain why the one that you are claiming does logically should. But then with rebuttal, it's good to have a couple of responses. The first is to think about whether that responsibility does actually exist. But the second thing is to think about maybe responsibilities do exist, but there are other ways to fulfill them. So maybe maybe the affirmative team runs an argument that says parents provide so much for their children, they like cook, they clean, all of this stuff, so the child has the responsibility to give back. And they should do that by paying for living costs. Maybe the negative team says, yes, it's true that children owe something to their parents, but maybe living costs is a bad way to do it, and that actually it's best for children to give something else back. And if you're on the negative team and you're making a constructive argument about the responsibility of the parents, or you're the affirmative team rebutting that, think about that in the same way. Why does the responsibility exist, and why should it be that it's fulfilled in this particular way? So I think that's a very interesting type of argument that's probably very different to most of the ones that you've come across before. The next thing is just to look at some more brainstorming of point ideas. So we've just looked at potentially one argument you might want to use is a principled argument, but there are other types of arguments as well, and these are all of your practical arguments. So look at why a certain person is likely to be benefited. Look at different people and how each of them is differently benefited. Why are children benefited? Why are parents benefited? Why is the government benefited? If you can come up with reasons why all of these varied groups are or are not benefited, that will mean that you end up with a very strong set of arguments for your side of the topic. So at this point, I usually recommend that you pause the video for a bit and you do a bit of brainstorming of these arguments. And then whether you're watching this with just by yourself or with the rest of your team, you then come together in a few minutes and you compare your ideas and see what you think of all of them. Cool. So hopefully you're now back and you've done a bit of brainstorming and you've done a bit of discussion. The next thing is just to go over structuring your argument. Now, I suspect I did go over this in the previous video for round one. So if you have any further questions, and I might explain it a bit shorter here because I have explained it previously, and you can go and have a look at that one. But the big thing to do is that when you are structuring an argument, explain why your argument is true. So let's say your argument is, this is good for children. Explain why it is true and all of the very different ways and the many varied ways that it's going to be true. And then you can give your examples and your evidence about how it's going to benefit them and explain why it's so important that they are benefited. And that means that you can end up with an argument that really clearly explains how someone is going to be helped and why it matters so much that they are going to be helped. And this will mean that you end up with a very compelling argument. And then likewise, when you're responding to the arguments, you want to be doing the same thing in reverse. So explaining why something is likely to be untrue, explaining why it's unlikely to be as realistic as the other team says, or why even if it's true, it doesn't particularly matter in the way that the other team says so. At this point in the video, if you attend the Zoom sessions that we have for these, there's a moment where you can ask questions. Obviously, you cannot ask me questions on a YouTube video, but if you have further questions about any of this, don't hesitate to reach out if you want any further clarification, or to check out the QDU's resources, such as the YouTube channel, as you've clearly already found if you're watching this, but also the LMS, which is our training resource, which is, I think, hopefully very useful, and you can get access to if you contact your school coordinator for further details about that. Thank you very much for watching. Best of luck for this debate and for all of your future debates into the future.